Welcome to the Fit Affiliate Podcast, where we talk about behavior and behavior-based conversations as they apply to CrossFit affiliate owners and coaches. My name's Lisa Hetherington. I'm your co-host, and I sit alongside Chuck and Tony, who are the founders of Fit Affiliate. Today's episode, we are blessed to have a very special guest with the one and only EC Synkowski. For those who've been around the CrossFit landscape for a little while, you will be familiar with her work in the nutrition space, particularly if you've delved into studying for your level 3, all those nutrition videos and all those great concepts presented very, very clearly and simply. For those a little newer, you've probably come across her work with the 800-gram challenge, lazy macros, and through her business of Optimized Me Nutrition. EC has a wealth of insight into behaviors and changing behaviors, but also has a unique ability to make very complex concepts very simple to understand and breaking it down into really common sense where you kind of think about things and go, oh, why didn't I think about it that way? Really entertaining chat. She's known Chuck and Tony for a really long time, so lots of good background there. I know you guys will enjoy this one. Make sure you share it, like it, and if you enjoy our content, please hit subscribe on whatever platform you're tuning in, whether it be Apple, Google, or podcast platforms, or here on the YouTube channel. We appreciate your support. Thanks for being part of the journey with us. All right, let's rip into the episode with EC.
Welcome back to another episode of the Fit Affiliate Podcast with Chuck and Tony as per usual. Today we're joined by the ever awesome EC Synkowski. And if you've been around the CrossFit world for long enough, you've definitely come across some of her stuff with Optimized Me Nutrition, the very famous 800-gram challenge. And for anyone that may have prepped for their level 3, I'm sure you've watched endless videos on the nutrition series. So welcome to the podcast. It's going to be a great chat today. We're really looking forward to talking to you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
I always laugh about these because I is it called the green room? Is that what we talk about before the podcast starts recording? Because there's always a joke in there, and so inevitably Lisa starts every one of these laughing. And if I was a listener, I'd be like, "What the fuck is so funny all the time?" But I guess that's
pull yourself together.
Joe Rogan recording. They're all just in there smoking joints. Be like, actually, we're all over the world.
It's just a little teaser to get people to maybe tune in and think they're missing something fun, which they are.
They are. The green room is where the magic happens.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, the one and only world's most famous EC Synkowski. So we're happy to have you on here. I think there's only one of you. So as far as I know of, so we're very happy, obviously, to have you on the podcast. But I suspect that maybe a lot of people don't know your backstory. So like Chuck was saying in the green room, I think the most important place for us to start is really talking about like who you are and where your journey started, and then we'll kind of get into like what you're doing now, if that's cool with you. You want to give us the synopsis of your decades of experience in this thing?
I'll try not to make it as long as it was, right? But yeah, I actually started out in environmental consulting. So I did expert witness litigation work for 7 years. But that actually overlapped with when I found CrossFit in 2006 and started working on the seminar staff that same year. So that was how I got so involved. But that was a time when the seminars weren't frequent and I was paying my own way to go to multiple seminars and all of that stuff. So that was sort of developing on the side while I was being an environmental consultant. And eventually that transitioned to a full-time position with CrossFit. Of course, many different hats, many different roles as they grew quite quickly in their seminar department. And stayed on seminar staff for technically a little over 10 years. And I resigned from CrossFit in 2017 as I was finishing a second master's in nutrition and functional medicine, which is what ultimately launched me into what I'm doing now with Optimized Me Nutrition.
I'm curious, was seminar staff your first foray into coaching and teaching? Or is that
I don't think technically.
Staff of consulting? Like, do you see an analog in consulting and coaching? And is that what drew you that way?
I actually started personal training in college just because I was interested in fitness. So I had the coaching kind of going.
Okay.
And in retrospect, some of my, I think, best teaching or abilities to teach clearly, if I do, is from my former boss in environmental consulting. So we would work on these trials where we would, in front of a jury, be fighting over millions and millions of dollars. And people who have never, my boss was a chemical engineering PhD. We would spend months and years trying to look through the data and figure out why chemicals are here and who caused it and what processes and all that stuff. And then you get in front of a peer of 12 people who might be teachers and architects and musicians and all of these things that have never thought about the millions and millions of pages of data that you've looked through and trained to be looked through. How in the world can you convince, convey, depict all of your knowledge in a way to help them understand the case clearly? And so he was a master in clarity. And I really bring a lot of his framework to, I think, what I do or try to do in nutrition.
That's super cool. Like looking at, hey, universally, we are a peer group in almost all life context, except this one isolated area of specialized knowledge. So how do you how do you connect the unknown to everything else that is known? That's cool. That's incredible to have formatively in your coaching.
One of my favorite memories of him is one of my first drafts I gave him. It was like describing a chemical site and what the problem was. And he what is this, a mystery novel? Not it wasn't clear enough, was not succinct enough, get to the point, what's the problem, all of that stuff. So he was a really great mentor to have.
That's kind of funny. So I think the first time that I met you was like probably right around that same time, like 2008, maybe it was like 2010. I'm fairly certain it was in Connecticut at a weightlifting seminar at Coach B was there, and I think you were there. And I think James actually ended up there too.
That's
I think that was the first. I can't remember if it was before. I just remember that weekend specifically. But it's funny to think about. That seems like, well, it seems like yesterday, but it also seems like it was like 2 lifetimes ago at the same time. Mainly because I think so many of us have gone in so many different directions since that day. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast. I think most people now know you as like EC, the nutrition resource, which you for sure have definitely been very instrumental in doing exactly what you just did, right? Which is taking a very, large, overreaching subject matter and distilling it down into very, very clear, very concise, very actionable, and very consistent, play on words there, things that people can do. I think that part's cool. But I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast are like, why did they bring the nutrition girl onto the business owner podcast? And so I think that for us, one of the things we wanted to share was one, just how fascinating you are as a human and the amount of things that you have been involved in, so they can understand that like, oh, if they do only know you through like the Optimize Me thing, which is like the new version of EC, like just how many other things that you've been through, touched, done, and otherwise, they'd be like, oh, pretty much most of what I know of CrossFit, she has in somehow, somewhere or another been instrumental in that, whether it be like training guides or otherwise. So I think that part for us is very important. But for us, the main thing on this coaching call or on this podcast is behavior and behavior-based conversations, right? And so I think few things convey that much like as well as nutrition does, right? Because like macros matter only so much as the person who's putting those into their mouth. So that's one of the reasons why I think you're the perfect fit for this podcast. So if people are listening to this, there's very few things that convey behavior as well as why you want to eat what you want to eat. And so that's one of the reasons that you're on here. So back to that original part of the conversation though, where I originally met you, I think you were already on, how long were you? So you were 10 years you were on seminar staff for?
Almost 11. So technically back in these old days, when you would go to your second seminar, you were coaching the people whose first seminar. So technically you could say I started on staff, like, I don't know, sometime in 2006. It became a paid gig for me, I think 2008. So they weren't as frequent as they are now, but there was a period of 1.5 years, 2 years where I was paying for myself to go to these things and be a trainer and all of that stuff. But I also was on Berg's team for a little while, on the weightlifting staff for a little bit. And so I think I was on that seminar, but I also don't know if I was just a guest there at that one. The memories get so jumbled.
I remember there was just no shortage. Like he was there. I think Sage. I don't remember. Natalie's father was there. Mm-hmm. There was 1 million people at that seminar.
I remember that. I can't remember everything.
Cody was there, I think. There was a bunch of you guys, and I was like, wow, there's like one coach per participant, because back then like 7 people came to the seminar. But so you were on staff for 10 years. At what point then did you make the full-time jump into HQ? How long ago was that?
That was 2011. And it was really when CrossFit was hockey sticking in terms of growth. At that point, the administrative team needed more behind the scenes besides Dave and Nicole. And so I really came on to work on some of the content, namely the level 1 training guide, which went through a lot of iterations and was finally published basically right before I resigned. So that was good to get that project finally done. But I started in a content mainly role, and it quickly evolved into a lot of operations, product management to include all of the ways that we had to manage staff, to include staff development, to include translations. I was proofreading Korean and Japanese at times. I'm not kidding. To accreditation requirements. I mean, CrossFit was growing so fast at that time that Glassman would always joke around that you'd be training somebody in something to do that you just learned 6 months ago. And it very much was like that. So it grew from content, and that actually became very, very small relative part of my role as I kind of continued there.
It's so funny. So that's what I mean by everybody who watches this. Your names, I don't know if your name is in the credits of the level 1 training guide. I don't know if anybody's names are, but there's so much of that. There's so many people have touched and so many moving pieces that are really like, I had no idea that so-and-so or this or that or this person was involved in it. And I think that's probably one of the cool parts of CrossFit is that there's just such a, I don't want to use the word organic, but there's such an investment from the entire community from so many different areas. People don't even realize just how much the whole thing was crowdsourced. All of it.
Yeah, some good stuff about that training guide is, Greg had some just beautiful, elegant, visionary stuff on fitness. And some of the problem was it was all organic and on videos. And, the other Tony that was around in the early days with the media team is I actually was getting old videos transcribed of various versions of his different lectures to pull together what was then put together in the training guide to be the quote best version. And technique was the hardest because his technique would always vary from location to location. He was very, as you know, he still is, but charismatic and be able to change the conversation based on who was there and stuff. And so technique was always an interesting one because it's such this conceptual thought, not necessarily like squat here with your heels there. We went through a lot of iterations of technique and lots of different transcriptions to get something that was really Greg's voice, but also became something that could be kind of universal in a single article and get the concepts across and all of that stuff. And so I am ultimately really proud of that project. It took a long time to get there, but I wanted to be really true to Greg's message that had some just gems in it for sure that needed to be preserved.
I think you nailed it. I mean, I'm a little bit biased to it, but I think that it was great. I actually never knew that that's how a lot of that technique, technique specifically, or any of that came to exist.
Technique. Oh yeah. That's when we were like, well, where is it? It's like, well, I just had X number of videos transcribed and they weren't the right ones because, Tony had been collecting so many videos that he didn't have them all cataloged. So I would just be like, let's pull this one off the shelf and see what happens.
Let's see what's in here. So no, not that one.
It was, it ultimately was great, but it was tough.
I think there was something to those early days that like with that specific format that Pat Barber had also talked about for his own development as a coach, having basically these pieces of repetitive video feedback of an otherwise set structured curriculum. It's in the delivery where he's like, well, I know what happens when people watch their own snatch time and time and time again, intention to improve. For you guys early on in the days of HQ, you were watching coaching. You were watching the delivery of the methodology on repeat with that being the focal point of how do we better convey this knowledge and thinking about what that did for your overall skill development in that role. I don't know. It's something that I wish I would have thought about earlier in my coaching journey to approach coaching the same way a lot of us approach like athleticism.
That's exactly right. It's one of the reasons why I think being on some of the seminar staffs, whether or not it's the L1 or, the gymnastics crew and all that stuff, is you develop so much more quickly because every weekend you're put on the spot and you get to watch new people and then you have people giving feedback on what you're doing, right? And so it's almost like this exponential growth as opposed to kind of just being in your own little silo and not being able to watch playback and not getting feedback on it. Yeah.
And you mentioned, so the feedback, I think that's like worth exploring in a second, because like the nature of feedback in those early days is very different than the feedback that generally exists, not just like organizationally, but in the community at large, because it's not the same sense of trying to earn your place constantly. Maybe that's my own tangent to like explore at a different time if you're not interested. But
I'm not sure I'm totally following, but keep going. Yeah.
Well, the one thing that you had mentioned is that like you would often find yourself teaching a concept that you had just yourself gone through. And we speak, at length pretty frequently that demonstration of mastery is your ability to teach someone else.
I would say that was more so from like the operational side of point than the seminar staff. I think the seminar staff, there would always be different kind of growth curves in the beginning, but they were very careful to make sure that people were ready. I mean, people are investing a lot of money
I was
to go.
On, like, the organizational sense, just even the ability, like, hey, you know how to build this process. Cool. Like get somebody else to build and follow this process, like by next week.
Totally. We needed to.
Yeah.
Totally. That was happening all the time behind the scenes. It was like, okay, well, this doesn't work. Like we have too many people coming in, or this changed, or now we have a whole new market. Like, so we have to go figure it out for sure. Yeah. But I think the development path, they really solidified it over years, but even in the early years, it was so well done in the sense of, we all started with like the press lecture, the least lecture that you're going to mess something up. And, technique was the last, because it just had so many like what ifs, and there wasn't a concrete necessarily right answer. Right. And I think they did a really phenomenal job with that sort of, I'm sure you guys had something similar with gymnastics, right? But just a really nice progression that really gave you something to work for, but it was with training wheels. It was in a controlled way so that you could get enough feedback and you could really have the time to develop and get really good at something before taking on too much.
For sure. For us, the big problem was that like the entire seminar was the technique lecture, right? Because like every single part of gymnastics was like, it was all so heavily nuanced and dependent upon the audience and the expectations in the room. And so I guess that was really the thing, like what you just said and you touched on in regards to seminars and really kind of that sort of forced growth that happens so quickly, that I think can only really happen when you happen to find yourself both fortunately and unfortunately in front of the whiteboard with a room full of coaches where you're just like, how the fuck did I get here? Right. And so you're like, but you have to deliver. And I think until you get into that point, few people understand just no matter how many times you've done it, the pressure never seems to subside, right? But that pressure seems to almost, create a diamond, so to speak, where that's the thing that brings so many people. So everybody knows the red shirts to be these pillars of like, professionalism and delivery and all these things. And it's like, that is all developed out of being able to think quickly on your heels, being able to, live up to the pressure, take the feedback, all those things that people don't really think about. They're like, oh no, we handpicked all those people because they were like the best version. I'm like, oh no, they were molded in fire. We all were, right? And like, I don't think people know truly what it's like to like go to bed on a Friday night knowing you're going to greet a room full of strangers and you must deliver, right? Not only because like it's your job, but like they pay a lot of money to be there. And I think it's a very small population of us who really truly believed in that and loved that and was like, I'm going to throw up every Saturday morning because it never seems to get any better. But I'm like, and then the clock starts and it's like, you blink and it's Sunday afternoon. Everybody's like, wow, you're so good at this. I'm like, thank you for that. Because like, I'm really just trying as hard as I can here. I have no idea what I just did, right? Like it just becomes this whole sort of thing where there's a lot of growth in there. And I think that's a very important thing. Like one of the things that we try to convey to most of the new coaches is that like there's 6 pillars of the professional coach. And like seminars become such a pivotal part of that in the middle, whether you become a red shirt or not. It's that ability to essentially stand in front of the whiteboard with a large targeted, audience specifically, but with a curriculum that you have to deliver. But most importantly, your ability to think critically and creatively on your feet and on your heels, to deliver that differently depending on the room, is such a piece of it, of the coach's journey, that I think a lot of people don't understand, because they get themselves in front of the room as a coach, but that's as far as they ever end up getting to, right? They never stop to think about like workshops or seminars or things of that nature. And there's just so much growth from getting yourself into a seminar team or even just putting your own seminar on. So I think that it's cool to hear you touch on that, even though you just kind of breeze through it. But it's such a big piece of you.
Yeah, I have done some other public speaking besides that as well, like a TEDx and some Ignite Boulder and stuff. And people would say this about the seminar staff, and they said it, some people were nice about those ones that I did as well. And people were like, oh, you look like you're having so much fun. And you're like, you have no idea how many times I said the TEDx thing. I mean, backwards to forwards, forwards to backwards, slow, fast, with the TV on, with somebody shining flashlight in my eyes to make it like the spotlight. After a workout when you're out of breath, like I said that thing constantly. And the only way that you can then interact with the crowd and watch that these people are bored about what you're saying and watch that this person has a question is when you know the material so well that you can react to them in real time.
Yeah.
That's the only way that you end up looking like you're having fun, because you can't be thinking about, well, my next line is talking about, I don't know, some shake diet. It has to be like, that's on autopilot. And now I can react to what this group is doing.
Right.
And so I do think that gets a little bit underlooked, is like when people are like, oh, you look like you're having so much fun. You're like, that's hours. I mean, that's hundreds and hundreds of hours, such that I can now be on the fly with you guys. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's very powerful. I think, so many people do stand, and they stand in the front or they watch person stand in front of the room, and it's that whole riding the lion thing. They're like, wow, EC is amazing, right? Like, she's so good at what she does. Like, I want to be like her. I'm like, well, get out the microphone, get out the camera, because you're going to have a whole lot of individual recitation until you get it perfect. Like, all those flights that you guys are idolizing, you're like, wow, you guys get to travel. Let me tell you what you do. You put your headphones in and you just reread everything until you get there. And then you're like, I'm going to do it again. Right. And like, it's just over and over and over again until, you do get to that point where you're right. Like when you do know something so well and you've practiced it so much, that's when essentially the nuance takes over. You don't have to be so rigid. I remember the early days of like, this is a funny story, I guess, anecdotally, but I used to always live off the computer, right? Like I was like, had to have the computer open because I read the notes. But like when I first started like leading the seminars, and I was in Kentucky, as a matter of fact, and my computer died. And I was like, I'm fucked. There's no way I can do it. At this point, I'd already led, I don't know how many seminars, but I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do next. So I couldn't read it. I was like, maybe I can get my iPad and open up. So I grabbed the iPad that I had, dead. And I was like, oh no. And this was like the beginning morning. And as you know, we teach both days all day, as opposed to like your segment. And so I literally had to give everybody a break. I was like, okay, unprompted break, go to the bathroom, and then come back. And I was like, can I cancel a seminar? Is that like a thing? Like, can I send them home for the day? Like, I had all these crazy, and then after that, you just kind of settle into it. And that was when it clicked to me. And I was like, that was actually the biggest curse. And that was the best seminar that I'd ever led. And it was probably like my 15th or 20th one ever at the time. But like, and that's when those things happen. But nobody would have ever known that peril, that panic, that trauma. But it was all that experience. But I think for me, that was that crystallization of like, okay, I can deliver this content with my eyes closed now. But you still practice it even just the same. I don't think I've ever told anybody that story, but I think Chuck maybe knows.
Now
that story.
they know.
It was a nightmare.
No.
Yeah.
I think like to at least contextualize what I said earlier so that it makes sense now and we can move forward is having the ability to get the consistency of feedback that was very structured, very deliberate feedback, because you didn't have this variability in what you were getting feedback on. You're delivering this curriculum to this type of audience for this type of purpose. And I think that's a huge gap that exists in our communities, in actual affiliates with box owners and their coaches, is coaching feedback is not frequent enough to begin with. And then the variability of how the feedback is being handled, but also what the feedback is based on, makes it an environment that like is probably not advantageous. If you look at, you know, what we've kind of all echoed, as well as other guests that have been on that seminar path track, it's like, if you want to get really good at the skill of delivering and coaching, make it simpler for yourself and the people in your care. Be able to isolate that skill development rather than trying to get the skill development and the technical development and the knowledge accumulation all in this big muddy mess.
Yeah.
So hopefully that makes more sense, but I don't know that there's a lot unless you want to kind of riff on that.
No, I think that's a really great summary. I don't want to reiterate it.
No. So how would what came next after HQ as you transitioned out of HQ? Where did we pick up the hero's journey at that point?
Yeah. So I actually started my second master's degree, the one in nutrition, while I was still at HQ. For the accreditation requirements, some of the senior staff had continuing education. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I was like, well, this master's degree looks interesting. Let me start it. It overlapped, of course, with some of the stuff I did. And I liked it. Turned out I liked it. So I was about, I think, 6 months away from finishing that degree. And it was just like, I didn't feel like I was giving some of my classes their full due. And at that point, professionally, I needed a little bit of a challenge and a change. Like a lot of stuff that I was working on had kind of gotten to steady state. And I was just like, I need a challenge and a change. So I decided to resign to kind of focus on my degree as I was finishing that out, with the intent of starting a nutrition practice, which I guess you could say I have, but I started it with this idea of just one-on-one consulting and to work with people in the functional medicine space on very specific medical nutrition therapy. Like I have autoimmunity or I have whatever GI disorder, and work with them that way. And I did that for a month and decided it wasn't for me after I finished the degree. So this is probably February 2017. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I resigned from a job that I liked with a business plan that I don't like. Yeah. So that was a very tough time. I ended up looking for work for about a year and a half while I was kind of doing Optimize Me Nutrition on the side. At that point, the 800-gram challenge had been launched and there was some interest. But as you know, the overnight success thing is really not an overnight success. You got to build an audience, you got to get in front of people, and you got to really go for that. So I was trying to work on that and keep that going, but it certainly wasn't at my mind in that time, like, okay, I'm going to do this nutrition thing full time. So there was a good year and a half there of like this looking for work, putting together odd jobs in Boulder, still coaching a bit, doing some really random stuff, but then also trying to get my nutrition stuff going, thinking, oh gosh, what the hell am I going to sell? And it's funny, just to kind of finish that thought though, it's like, I just came out of this position where I like had a good role in content development, education. I liked clarity. I liked teaching. And I've got a couple, whatever degrees. And I'm thinking, gosh, what to sell? What am I going to sell? I don't really know what I should sell. And it took me, I don't know, a good year and a half, 2 years. I was like, I'm going to sell education, everybody. And so that's where I've kind of settled on now, is I sell programs related to nutrition education. But it's just so funny. It's like, here's the person who went to all this school, supposedly, actually had a job that was delivering this in another field, writing courses and curriculum, and still took a while to figure it out for herself. But here we are.
Such is the nature of the journey.
For sure. Hero's journey, no doubt. For all of you guys that don't know, EC collects master's degree like most people collect Pokemon cards. So definitely she's the poster child for a student of life. So that for sure, I think is, when I first met you, was probably one of the things that was very obvious, was that you were studious, so to speak, but you were very, very educated and frankly drawn very much to that. And I don't think that that's rare so much in the affiliate community, but it is definitely, it's eye-opening when you do meet somebody who is very driven to learning, who is very perpetually curious, especially at the level that you are, to pursue like multiple master's degrees and otherwise. And so I think that part to me was always like, I think where I immediately garnered my respect for you, I was like, if I have a question, I'm going to EC all the time. Right? Like, I just always going to do it. Like, and most of the time, what was nice about that is that you would be very willing to say to me, like, I don't know the answer to that. Like, here's where you should maybe potentially look. And I think very early on, years and years ago, I think I'd asked you a question about something, and I kind of gotten a frame of that same sort of question. And I was like, wow, it's rare to find somebody in the industry who's willing to be wrong. Right? Or not willing to be wrong, but doesn't need to be right, so to speak. And there's so many people. And I think that for me, that was one of the first points where I was like, I love her. She's fantastic. And I think that was just an instant amount of respect. So it was natural for me to watch you kind of make this journey into other things. I don't know as though I guess it would have made sense for you to move to nutrition as I step back and think about it. But I remember when you stepped away from HQ, I think I was in Colorado right when you did that. And I was like, what are you going to do? And you were kind of like, I actually don't know, because I think that was like right after your month of like, this is what I'm going to do. And I think you were like feeling of like, I've made a choice and I'm not sure that was the right choice. So watching the whole thing kind of pan out into what is now your overnight success. I don't think the 800-gram challenge was even a baby at that point in your brain. Yeah. And then people all of a sudden were walking around. A couple of months later, I see everybody just walking around eating cucumbers. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? Everybody's like, 800-gram challenge. I'm like, that CrossFitters love to measure. It makes complete sense. So what is the draw to nutrition for you? Like, I know that you were kind of always chemically associated and otherwise, and that makes complete sense. But like, how did you land in nutrition so heavily as opposed to like, physical training or otherwise?
Yeah, I wish I had the answer. I would like the answer because I don't really know. I talked about this with one of my groups recently. It's like, I don't actually know why nutrition is my gig. But I do really like making the complex simple. I think that's a theme that I've done in a few different of my roles, including the environmental consulting one, including even some of the CrossFit portrayal. And I think that continues now. And so I think that's really my love of it. And I think, of course, it's needed and we can do some good work and help people make some really great changes. So that's really positive too. So I think that's kind of it. But I also think, a lot of people get into nutrition because they've had some sort of transformational outcome from it. Maybe they were unhealthy and they became healthy, or something in their life that they cared about, and all of that stuff. And that's great. I'm not putting that down at all. It really drives a lot of passion. But I think what not having a transformational experience with nutrition allows me to do is to be really not dogmatic about a certain thing. When somebody has a transformational experience with paleo, they kind of get these blinders on that it was only paleo. Or because I never had this thing where I like lost all this weight or like fought off some disease or something like that. I'm just sort of like, well, let's look at this holistically, right? And so I think that's sort of also what I can bring to the space is just that level of like not dogma that hopefully gets people away from some of the stuff that just isn't really serving them.
A more objective reality. So not only like not having any like trauma bonding to a story about nutrition, do you think having the chemical background is a part of that you could look at it from a more scientific viewpoint before that was the context and vehicle? Or do you think that's separate for you?
No, I do think that's interesting. I mean, biology is infinitely complex that, the more you learn, you're like, wow, I really have no idea what's going on. So there's always more to learn. There's always more to keep going into. And so I think the background now makes sense more now that I'm here. But for a while there, I was like, why did I do all that biology? But I think now when you see these really simple claims or headlines or clickbait and all of that stuff, you're like, oh my God, that is not capturing, 1/10 of the nuance and detail that's really there in terms of the biological system. So I do think having the background has really helped me be careful almost in wording to try not to close off too many doors and try not to make things too black and white.
There's a very obvious, if you've been around it, and obviously I have because I've known you for so long, but like if you've watched your approach to nutrition since you've taken it on, your evolution through that has actually been relatively fascinating. Maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm a little more sensitive to things like this, and obviously I like you, but in the beginning, I think you were obviously having the right conversations with the right people, but I think those conversations are being guided by the people. And now there's for sure this, especially through the Consistency Project, your ability to take these relatively massively overcomplicated just conversations and constructs and boil them down into very simple like concepts and premises that I think most people, I don't know as though they saw that from the beginning, but now like it's become this, again, overnight success where everybody's like, I can go there because you have managed to take these things, turn them into like relatively small snippet podcasts in episodes, or even just reels now, where people are just like, oh shit, right? Like, and I think, and I mostly just troll you and say dumb things about ice cream on there all the time, but that's really what I'm here for.
Appreciate it.
But I think it's cool to watch that happen and watch you move into that sort of mastery. You're just like, let me just make this a little bit more elegant for all of you guys, because the nuance doesn't necessarily matter so much as the behavior does.
Yeah. And again, some of that framework is from my former boss who I already mentioned. And some of that is really from Greg and CrossFit. Yeah. He used to talk a lot, and this was some of his early What is Fitness lectures, and especially once he got into the metabolic pathways, but he's like, basically biochemistry be damned. Give me increased work capacity across broad time and low domains. What's the best diet there is? The one that best increased work capacity across broad time and low domains. How much body fat can I have? The one that best increases work, ad nauseum, to the point of like this idea of like, you have to hang your hat on this measured endpoint. You can't be so lost into like, what's the cellular mechanism, or what is this molecule doing at this point? It's like, did I lose the weight? Did I improve the health marker? Did I get more pull-ups? And just like, keep your eyes on that, because you are going to be so distracted along the way if you look at other things. Show me the measured output. Show me the measured output. And that's what I find that I try to do a lot in my podcast. It's like I want to give people some of the flavor of the complexity and why there's all these shiny objects along the way. But ultimately, it comes back to some really basic things that, come back to some basic practices that we just need to stay focused on.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things you touched on earlier. I wanted to bring back up too was really just those early days, because I think Chuck said it. We had Barbara on, and he basically talked about his sort of like circumstantial happenstance, sort of, I was just in the right place at the right time, and Tony basically dragged me on the road, and like I was just shooting these videos, had no idea what these videos are, and like he very much accredits a lot of that to being like the person he is now. He's like, I just watched so much video because I recorded and then I had to edit it. It was the same thing that you just said. He was just like, you were just hearing the same thing over and over and over again. But I think that even like you guys have unique outliers. Like you obviously had to condense an entire like Library of Congress of Greg, so to speak, into like a handful of pages. And then Pat obviously had to edit all these videos that later you had to watch through. But there's definitely a recurring theme on pretty much everybody on seminar staff or somebody who's been around CrossFit for a long time, is that regardless if you were in those rooms or you had to watch those videos, the elegance in which Greg was able to articulate things, they were so simple and so concise. They were everywhere, right? Like those little, like the work capacity thing, they were such a broad conversation and so many small conversations that I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that as much as like, there's obviously very prolific examples like you guys who had to watch thousands of hours of video, right? Like you're going to get it. But like, if you look back at like, the same snippets are in every single one of those videos over and over and over again. Like the Gregisms are just so prevalent. And I think that's what made it so easy for this thing to just grow so fast, that all of us were just like, it was just indoctrination almost. And I think that part was definitely interesting. So that was what I was going to ask you is, so obviously your first boss and then that part. So how do you think that watching all those videos and condensing it into that training guide and all those things, what type of effect do you think that had on the person that you are now and the coaching perspective that you have now?
Yeah, that's interesting. Those videos and just a lot of being around Greg and stuff, again, it really was this measured approach to things. I mean, the 800-gram challenge, my lazy macros, calories, measurement is so important to guide what we're doing and to know if what we're doing is right or wrong. And I think that's some of the beauty of it. I think some of the other stuff about CrossFit and why you said this stuff like just took off and indoctrinated, it's almost like it's so effective it doesn't matter that people know those details. Like that's how effective the program is.
Like if we can objectify a simple North Star, it allows us to fix all the behaviors that are otherwise problematic. There's a million issues that a million people have with food, but you're like, get your 800 grams, it'll fucking sort for itself. And they're like, it can't be that simple. And you're like, it can be that simple. That doesn't mean it's easy. It's the same thing across. Like, well, are you fitter? They're like, well, I mean, what about? And it's like, no, are you fitter or less fit? Like, focus on that and everything else starts to solve for itself. It's a system of inputs and outputs.
What I've found is that typically the most simple things are the more well thought out. Even though it appears on surface value, that's it. Conversely, I could give you your 30-step nutrition perfect plan to perfection, and it's going to have holes in it because it has lost some of the nuance with all of these steps and rules and exclusions and whatever and all this other stuff. And so Greg's stuff for CrossFit, it's like there's so much underlying that in terms of the metabolic pathways and the programming and why it works and the fact that he has it in the community and how he can drive people to do habit change for something that's hard to do voluntarily. In something where we're not making a lot of strides in as a society, and yet he's figured out a way to have people work hard voluntarily. There's so much to the whole thing, but people actually don't have to know that. They don't have to know about the glycolytic pathway. They don't have to know about the posterior chain in the squat. And so the same thing, I like to try to believe there's a little bit there with the 800-gram challenge. I can talk to you all day about calories and macros and quality and why we get all of these wonderful health benefits and performance benefits and all that stuff. At the end of the day, it's like, did you eat the fruits or vegetables or not? And so, I mean, I think that's, again, a lot of what I took away from Greg and just his methodology and the way he thought about things is that framework of like, what's the end result? What's the end result? And really being focused on that.
I love it. I think that's very cool. So In that same framework, then, you've got a lot of things going on now. So what is the big projects? What is the next phase of the evolution of EC? What are we working on now? I always love to watch this, but I don't even know if you can tell me. I feel like you're like a government agent. I never know what you're working on until it comes out. But I'm like, I've been working on that forever. You just never talk about it. So what's the next big stepping stone here?
Going and growing, trying to anyway. Continuing with my masterclass, that's really my core product now. It's this several week diet program where people go through the phases and they learn about their diet and hopefully come to some level of clarity and some realisms that are there. But ultimately, that's also the first stage for people who want to be affiliated coaches with me. So I've had people been asking for this for a long time, and I've been slow to develop it for various reasons, but now people can be an 800-gram challenge and a lazy macros coach. So after they do the master's class, they can then go on to take a simple kind of coaching basics course and then become an affiliate for those two programs. I'm rolling that out this month, which is exciting because, of course, I've had a good number of gyms do those challenges already. And so one of the problems is like challenges are for 30 days, right? And then, of course, you have a new member walk in. It's like, well, the challenge ended. What can I do with this new member in front of me? And so now becoming an affiliated coach can allow you to continue to teach, use the methodology and all of that stuff. So I'm excited about that. It was one of those things that people kept asking for. And I was like, I guess I should do this. So I'm going to give it a shot and see what happens.
I think I was in one of the people. I was like, you should definitely. And you're like, not off the radar, not off the docket. I'm like, they're working on other things. I was like, you should definitely. I think I kept saying it, but so I'm pumped to hear you say that. That's cool. So that's basically.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but one of the things I wanted to kind of was really hard for me was, I think there's a lot of noise in the nutrition space, right? And the last thing I wanted to do, fair statement, was to like. How do I say this? Like certify nutritionists. Yeah. I wanted to be very clear that like, this isn't like now you should go off and opine about people's insulin and thyroid. It's like, no. If you're affiliated with me, we are habit coaches. We're talking about what you ate. You know what I mean? And it took me a really long time to wrap my mind around wanting to do a program like this because for me, it's a very big scope thing. And because you guys are the CrossFit audience, I'm going to go down this tangent. Like the magic of CrossFit is not when people show up to their 4 p.m. class and sit down and learn about the glycolytic pathway and the phosphagen pathway. The magic of CrossFit is you get them to do the pull-ups, the squatting, and the running. And so the same thing is going to be true with my habit class. They show up to class and they do the gosh darn class. They don't think about it. We don't learn. Now, I don't want to, again, I'm into education, so I'm not against learning, but it's like, it's the doing where the magic is. And so the same thing is going to be true with my coaches. We're not talking about the thyroid and insulin. We're not. We're talking about what did you have for breakfast? What did you have for lunch? How did the weekend go? Did you eat the fruits and vegetables? Okay, what do we need to do? Where do we need to buy food from? What are some good ideas? It's very habit-based because that's where the magic is in nutrition, just like the magic is in the movements for CrossFit. It's not the theory. It's beautiful theory and it's there, but that's not what the coaches need to be doing. So anyway, sorry to cut you off there, but it kind of took me a while to wrap my mind around like, okay, what's the scope of this? What's the focus? And so now I feel more comfortable to move forward.
Well, that's cool. I mean, it's a great segue. Actually, I'm glad you cut me off. I mean, it's essentially the same conversation Chuck and I had with affiliate because it's the same thing, right? There's no shortage of noise in the business help space, right? Like it's the same. It's the same. It's bottom feeding, just like nutrition is, right? It's very easy to come in and just throw hope to these people who are just like, you want to have sex with lights on, and just eat only meat for the next 30 days, or like same thing with business. You want to make more money? I'll get you as many Facebook leads as you can possibly get, right? Like, so there's all this space. So we didn't want to come in and be like, I didn't really actually care what you guys were doing, right? So like when we built the company, it was the same sort of, because coaching is coaching is coaching. And this is one thing that we talk about a lot in this podcast is that people need to understand the difference between teaching and coaching. There's nothing wrong with teaching and training, but they're not the same thing as coaching, right? Like most coaches are in fact teachers or trainers, but coaches, they're here to affect behavior, right? We're here to ask questions, to modify behavior and change and affect habits. It has very little to do with what you need to do and a lot more to do with why you're doing what you're doing, right? And like nutrition, I think is like we talked about in the beginning, is one of those very polarizing places where it's not necessarily that the food that you eat doesn't matter. It's more so about why you're making the choices that you're making. And so if you can affect that, all the macros and the micros in the world won't matter until you can change the person who's putting the food in their mouth. And it's the same thing in business for us, was that like, we didn't want to enter a space and be another person adding the noise. We wanted to eliminate that noise by being like, advice has never been the problem. You guys can Google any answer you want. You're just not going to do it, right? Because you're the same person who's still Googling the same answer because you want there to be a cheat sheet, just like you want paleo to work, or you want keto to work, you want all these things to work. Stop abdicating responsibility. Let's just look at the behavior and let's change it. And so that was really what we set out to do with it. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm so fond of what you're working on through everything you've got going on, is because it's the same thing. You're touching on the behavior part of it, as opposed to like, we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of the science and all that stuff. That stuff's great. I'll teach you all that if you want to know it, but you don't care about that because at the end of the day, you already knew you needed to eat chicken and broccoli. You're just not doing it. Why? And then like, well, no. I don't want to talk about that part. Let's talk about what I should eat. I'm like, well, clearly you're not going to do that because you Google it. So I think that part's cool. And I'm glad that you have put that together, because I do think that's big. That's a big missing piece. There's nothing wrong with anything that a lot of people are teaching. They just overlook the most glaringly obvious thing. It's still a person who has to make that decision, right? It's their habits, it's their behaviors, it's their trauma, their past, their experiences, et cetera, that are going to make those choices much easier and much harder for them.
Totally.
So that rolls out this month then? Or when does that roll out? The new.
That's great. Yeah, there's some hiccups in some of the design of some of the pieces of that, but it hopefully is this month.
Some hiccups in the design. I can only imagine what you are actually festering over as this applies to that. I no doubt that it will be great once it does actually roll out. So that'll be exciting. So that's the big initiative for you now. That kind of took on a life of its own. I know how you ended up at that stage. So if this goes well, what is the end game for you?
Yeah. From the beginning, I don't know that I've really ever said this, but from the beginning, I have wanted to build an app because I think there's something there that can work better than the existing models. I think their focus in the existing models is on logging and tracking, and people don't want to log and track. But people like community and people like accountability. And so I do want to go that direction. But, you don't just start building an app just to build an app. You have to have it really clearly thought out and tested and do it in stages. And so some of my products, I kind of am testing that a little bit and figuring that out. But I would like something large scale that people can be exposed to, some education as well as accountability, keeping something sticky to really encourage this habit change. That would be great, because then ultimately I scale, and it's not about scaling. It's just about getting more people to be able to make the effective habit changes, right? Because there's just one of me, where if there's something, a technology piece that can leverage that would be cool. So that would be an end game. It's a ways away.
I love it. That's cool. Why is that important to you though, I guess is my question. Is it the intention to help as many people as possible, or what's the motivation?
Yeah, why not? Why not? It's just like CrossFit, right? We can be rosy-eyed about the old days and they were fun and great, but we ultimately want the program to help a lot of people, right? So you want to see it grow, and why not?
That was another part in the middle, as we were talking through things too, which I think is another sort of central conversation for us in the podcast, which is the absence of what's, or the absence of whys usually make what's into whys, right? And I think that we touched on a little bit as people were moving from the early days of CrossFit, then we got into that, I guess we'll call it that messy middle, although I think we're still technically in the messy middle era of really in the messy middle now. But it's that phase where it grew so fast, so big, and so quickly that people just, they stop appreciating the elegance and the simplicity that, that was just, what's the outcome? What do you want? Is it going to increase your work capacity? Is it going to increase your work capacity? That was the only thing that mattered. And then somewhere in the middle, I think as the masses arrived, it became less about the why, which was, moving this whole thing forward, and more about the what's, more workouts, more intervals, more things, more stuff added on the top of it. And so now we've arrived there. And I think you and I had talked about this a little bit when you were coming on, was that I think the cool part about CrossFit for me is I've been around it for a very long time now, over 15 years, in watching where so many of those early friendships I have settled, right? Like you, me, Steeler, like, et cetera. We've all seemed to have settled back into something that is very Y-centric, where we've taken the principles and the pillars of the confusion of CrossFit, where we've all gone back to the basics. You're like, you know, with you in nutrition and Spieler in lifestyle and us in business. And there's so many of those things. All those lessons were taught to us through CrossFit, right? Like we all did was take the lessons, the principles in the, you know, the pillars of CrossFit and then applied them to life, to nutrition and to business and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I think that part is relatively cool, especially because I get to see my friends be successful and doing in different endeavors. But what do you think it was about, you know, growing up through that elegance phase that made it so powerful for us to want to all go back towards like, I want to go to something simple, stupid, so to speak, right? Like I want to get back to the basics, the elegance, the simplicity of it, and really truly appreciate something I put myself into, not like the chaos and the confusion, so to speak.
Because it works, right? I mean, you know, I don't know what's happened since 2017. I can't speak to it, but I can tell you that until 2017, there was not a single person who was hired as a marketing person at CrossFit, which money businesses would consider that would like shooting yourself in the foot. There was not a single. Now, of course, we marketed the games as marketing. You know, any of the content you can consider as content marketing. I get it. But there was nobody there that was like driving a marketing initiative, and it grew to be quite successful. Because it works. The product
Some
worked.
would say.
Yeah. I mean, the product worked, right? I mean, like I think they've actually used it as a Harvard case study for that reason. I mean, it's like, how do you drive this really wild organic growth with like no marketing? There's not a single person in like venture capital who's still, I'm not saying that it's dumb to do marketing. Marketing certainly is useful and all of that stuff. But I think at the end of the day, what it teaches you is that you have to, again, have something that works. And so I think, you know, maybe all of us have also tried a few of these other these other shiny objects, and we're like, wow, that didn't really quite work how I thought it would work, and just kind of keep pulling away on these details down to the essential pieces.
Well, that's so true. It's very much so like a Glassmanism that like obfuscation is the curse of the novice. And so the application is like, whether we're trying to apply it to our nutrition, whether it's us with our own programs and workouts, whether it's us as coaches and how we approach clients, you're just not far enough along in the journey if you seek to make it complex for any reason at all, whether it's your conveyance of knowledge or your ability to affect behavior change. And so like, that's the good filter for us to pass things through, is like, why can we make it more simple? If we can't make it more simple, like what's the limitation? But like, why wouldn't we start there first? And fuck, I wish I had the answer as to why it took all of us so long to come back to just, you know, like it's behavior. In like, we look at why CrossFit was so successful with all of us and with the entire planet. And you're like, it's world-class fitness in 100 words plus 3 on 1 off. Just that's it. That's your answer. Yeah. And you're like, nah, that can't be the answer for like fitness and nutrition and longevity. And you're like, no, it is. It's the behaviors that framework establishes that leads you to success. So I wish I knew why it took us all so long to get to that view.
And that's one of the things that, you know, I think is quote magic about CrossFit is they drive behavior change better than most. And part of it is the community, right? It's the showing up, it's being around the people, it's the shared suffering. And I think, you know, people went through this phase of like, oh, you know, I like my garage gym workouts, and that's fine. Like, more power to you. Do the fitness where you want to do it. But I also think post-pandemic, people are happy that gyms are open again and to go back, right? Because it's like, yeah, you do work harder. That whole thing about like men will die for points and stuff. It turns out it helps.
0 super uncomfortable friends have gone down in that garage gym as compared to any affiliate that I've been in.
Well, totally. I mean, I still go to an affiliate here, and when I jump in class, I certainly work out harder than just on my own. And it's just like, yes, I mean, I've said this before, but I really think CrossFit is the experts in doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the community aspect, that's why another thing about the nutrition thing, it's like how to build community around nutrition. It's one of the reasons I run my masterclass in groups. I think people like going through things together. I think they like hearing about other people's struggles and ups and downs. I don't think they always want to hear from me. They shouldn't want to always hear from me. Gosh, you can learn from somebody else in the group, right? And so that's one of the reasons, again, it's like the power of the community to create habit change is what I'm, again, trying to mirror in nutrition. But yeah, I mean, habit change is hard, as you know. And I think CrossFit is one of the more successful models to get people to do it in an effective way, right? Get results.
It's one of the reasons why we're so avidly, I mean, the whole company was built to protect the affiliate model, right? I think there's a lot of people right now who are trying to attack it, manipulate it, change it, do whatever. Because like, it seems like the obvious thing to do, right? Like if we can just standardize the affiliate model, if we can just improve the affiliate model, like that whole thing is perfect. And it's perfect because it was always elegant. Greg designed it. Maybe it was even an accident. Who really knows? But like the simple ability for every affiliate to be individual, unique is really, I think, the thing that really drives that experts in doing thing, right? Because like there's nothing left to do but to do in an affiliate. And so I think that for us, it's that same sort of conversation, is that like the affiliate model is perfect and it doesn't need to get more complex. Like affiliates are boring businesses, not because like they don't do great things, but like they're not that difficult. Keep it that way. Like don't make them overly complex. Like giving them this massive book of standard operating procedures and things to do, like it's never going to work for the same reason why it just isn't going to work in anything else they do. And so like it's the same thing. And I do agree that the elegance of the whole thing, I think, was what drove it. But it is fascinating to hear somebody else also just be like, there was no marketing, right? And like we've talked about this 100 times, like it worked, and that was the marketing. Right? Like we all trauma bonded through this one way or another, and like we came out the backside, and you call it whatever you want, but like the zealots drove the thing forward because there was just no way to argue against it, right? Like even poorly executed CrossFit still works.
Yeah,
it's
like anything that I've ever been aware of.
Yeah. And to counter my point of that there was no marketing, I mean, you could also argue that Greg was on the forefront of content marketing. He gave it away for free, and it was just people doing the workouts and explaining the methodology. So you could also say that, no, I mean, it was marketing all along, sure. But nobody in the sense of like, and now we're going to run this ad, and now we're going to check on the clicks, Yeah.
There's a really good, my favorite book on marketing is by Seth Godin, and it's This is Marketing.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I think that encapsulates like all of it, is like his way to think about the entire concept of true, real, powerful, viral marketing is people like us do things like this. And that's what CrossFit sold, is like people like us do things like this. And if you want to be a person like us, you do these things. And this is our message, and that sells itself.
Mm-hmm. Totally. 100%.
Well, sweet. I mean, I'll keep going on this, so you all have to shut me down. I know Lisa's going to be like, all right, and this is where we're going to shut it down right here.
Where should people go to find out more about you and your things? Give us the rundown.
OptimizeMeNutrition.com. Same handle on Instagram and Facebook, Optimize Me Nutrition. And then my podcast is The Consistency Project,
which I definitely recommend everybody who's listening to this also go subscribe to that one because it's fantastic. I think the key there is that they're very small and consumable podcasts, especially in overreaching complex conversations. I think for me, even in the beginning, I was like, I love EC. I want to listen to these podcasts, but I don't want to spend an hour listening. And I was like, oh, these are great because they're like just little small chunks, which is great.
Good. Thank you.
I know that we'll end up dragging you back on here because there's lots of other things I want to talk about, especially like some of the stories and like the travels and things of that nature, because those stories are always fantastic. I did want everybody to get an idea of who you actually are behind this whole thing, especially as you're about to roll this whole thing out. And if you're listening to this, obviously make sure you follow EC. But we'll bring you back on because I would love to catch up a little bit more, but I'm just glad that we got you on here this time. And then if we can help you promote that, because elegance is the answer. So, and I know
awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on. Good to see you guys.
Really, you as well.
Thank you, my friend, for listening to the Fit Affiliate podcast. If you would be interested in hopping on a free call with us to just kind of chat about what you think your problems are and what you think the gap is between where you're at and where you want to go, we can see if maybe we can help you along that journey, figure out if we're all a good fit to do some sweet things together. So click the link, set up a consult. Let's help you identify some problems that we can mutually solve.